Today, I'm going to be reacting to a video by Ron Woosley. Ron is one of the founding members of Coming Out Ministries. Coming Out Ministries is not helping people to come out of the closet or, say that they're gay, but they are, in their own understanding, helping people to come out of homosexuality or the homosexual lifestyle or their sin. This is kind of the way that they frame it. It's definitely not something I agree with, but I think it's important nonetheless to understand them. And some of you coming to this video might be considering having Coming Out Ministries or a similar type of a ministry speak in your church or your group, or you might be considering some of their resources. So I just want to have a good open conversation about this. Now I get to talk to you about an organization I absolutely love. Seventh-day Adventist Kinship International. They're especially focused on Adventists, people of Adventist heritage, or who are connected to Adventists and who are either allies or LGBTQ people themselves. They're an affirming organization, and they have meant the world to me. When I was first coming out, it was a really difficult time, and they were absolutely there for me. People from the organization talked to me. I'm a member, which gives me access to all kinds of social media groups. I watch their YouTube channels, the resources on their website. It's a fantastic organization. I suggest you check them out. Link in the show notes. I've described more in depth in a previous video why I believe that they are in fact teaching the principles of conversion therapy, even though they say that they are not doing that. And I will be breaking down more where conversion therapy came from, how we know it's not effective, and some of those things. But I thought it would be useful to understand more in depth the kind of stories they're telling about themselves and the kind of interpretations they're sharing about their own lives. So I thought we'd look at this video and go from there. So I do want to warn you, there's a little bit of graininess in the video, but I think it's worth it. A little bit of odd framing, but the audio is good, and I think it's worthwhile to respond to. And also a content warning. There are references to sexual assault, including the sexual assault of children, and they are not particularly graphic, but they are present.
I was derailed at the age of 4. A farmhand working for my father molested me, sexually molested me. And I'll tell you, it affected the rest of my life. I mean, I'm living with consequences of that today. And you'll see what I mean by that. I felt guilt. I felt shame. I was embarrassed. But I'll tell you, from that day forward, I never had a clear mind without sexual thoughts. Every day of my life, I relived what happened. Now, that man molested me one time, but maybe you'll understand when I say that I self-abused from that day forward.
What he's describing is not particularly unusual for children who are the victims of sexual assault, especially at such a young age. They're too young to understand that it's not their fault, and they implicitly trust adults at that age. So that shame and that guilt is very common in sexual assault survivors. And he also references compulsive sexual behavior even on a daily basis. And this is one of the problems that arises when children are abused in that way. They don't know what's happening, and they don't understand. It's too early for that part of their body to then their awareness to really come about, and it can develop into these kinds of compulsive behaviors. And as we know, shame leads to compulsive behaviors as well. So it's kind of a vicious cycle, and it's really difficult. So it's just a very real thing that he's sharing. And let's see kind of where he goes with that.
It caused me some problems because even at 4 years old, knowing that what happened was wrong, I did not run to mommy and daddy to tell on myself. Does that make sense? Because what happened was wrong. I felt guilty. I wasn't going to tell what happened to me. My goodness, I couldn't do that. And that's really sad, because had I been able to communicate with my parents, it could have alleviated the whole thing. Communication, folks, is so important with your children. If they're old enough to ask the question, they're old enough to get an answer, age appropriate.
So this was really great. When people experience abuse of any kind, almost as important or maybe even equally important to the abuse they actually experience is the response of their community. And whether they internalize that this is just how people think I should be treated, or whether they internalize that, oh, this is not my fault, and people stood up for me and people protected me and I was given a safe place where I could share what happened to me. So he is saying that that is the kind of communication that is important, and even so with children. A lot more can be said about it, about how you can create that kind of environment for your kids, how you can give them a sense of their own bodily autonomy, and how you can clearly communicate to them what is and isn't okay touch and all of those things, and clearly communicate them that if something happens, it's not their fault and that they should tell you no matter what that person says. There's a lot more that could be said here, but the core of what he said is exactly what needed to be said, and it's very good to hear that. So he associated very strongly the sense of shame that was connected to his sexuality, like all victims of abuse experience, or are prone to experience, I should say. And he experienced that at a very young age. So he kind of came into, even way before puberty, had this experience of associating shame with his sexuality.
When I was 9 years old, my parents took me to a doctor to see what is wrong with Ronnie. He's 9 years old and still wetting the bed. Mm-hmm. The doctor examined me carefully and did whatever he does, and he said, "There's nothing wrong with your little boy. He's just lazy."
This is so painful. You know, I would like to hope that medical care has progressed from this point and that he would get a referral to a psychologist or to a therapist, but it's really an awful compounding of something already terrible in his life.
So what do you think? My dad doubled down on his discipline. It only made matters worse. And so I grew up feeling unloved by my father. I could never please him. I was an embarrassment to him. I never got the affirmation that I needed. I had two older brothers who were macho. I was gentle.
This is a very common feature of those kind of ex-gay narratives, and this what's called reparative therapy is this disrupted relationship with a parent. Now, in the ex-gay narrative, that disrupted relationship with a parent and this sense of really just not being comfortable and being alienated and rejected by your same gender parent and by people of your same gender is seen as causative of being gay. So let's see where he goes.
I was a gentleman and they were macho men. I like to think maybe I'm a little of both now. I don't know. But anyway, I idolized them because, I mean, they were mechanical and they had motorcycles and they had guns and they liked firecrackers and everything I hated because of the noise. I didn't like noise. I liked music. At the age of 5, I started playing the piano. And I got called sissy and why don't you just go play with the girls? And because I didn't fit in with any of the boys in my sphere at that time. So now I started feeling alienated from my brothers. Can you see what was happening?
Okay, when he says, "Can you see what was happening?" He's beginning to imply that there's this interpretation of this kind of gender alienation, which is a really common phrase to talk about being alienated from one's gender. And a lot of what is typical in these kinds of narratives, these ex-gay narratives, reparative conversion therapy narratives, is that there's an emphasis on these past rejections and traumas as causative of homosexuality, and it tends to obscure larger social problems. I mean, when he was called a sissy, that's a gay slur that he was called at a very young age. He was already being called gay slurs as a child. And the assumption that this was causative of his being gay rather than a result of his being gay seems pretty difficult to justify, really, and does seem to obscure the wider cultural critique that needs to take place, where kids shouldn't be bullied for for a boy shouldn't be bullied for playing the piano or for being emotionally cognizant and aware. And this goes for gay boys and straight boys and all boys. We have an epidemic in our society of making men feel like they are not allowed to be tender and in touch with their emotions. And that larger critique is very important. Boys can play piano too. I think that's kind of a better, more productive direction to move in society. It's worth talking about. But I don't believe where he's going with this.
I was feeling more and more alienated from my gender because the people of my gender were ridiculing me, mocking me, teasing me. And it didn't help that I learned to play the piano and started crocheting and all those things. I had all this confusion in my head. By the time I was old enough to learn about birds and bees, I already had years of habitual thinking in the wrong direction.
So this relates back to his trauma. He'd already developed compulsive sexual behaviors as a very young child when he hit puberty.
And that's the direction my mind went. And I didn't know how to control that. So I faked it. But you know, while I was in college, I was faced with all of this confusion that just kept growing with every year, every birthday. I was like every year, more and more confusion about my identity and my sexual attractions.
So when he's talking about feeling confusion, I believe he's referencing, and sexual attraction, he's referencing having a sense of being attracted to the same gender.
And I had been celibate up to this point. However, I was repeatedly victimized in grade school by an older student. I was victimized even in the military repeatedly. So graduation day came, and it wasn't long after that I had my fall from grace. After all those years and all of that struggle in my mind, I finally took advantage of an opportunity, and when I was victimized, I wasn't hooked. But when I willingly sought it out and participated, I was addicted instantly, and I knew it.
Okay, so he's brought in a new word now, and he said he was addicted. So he is talking about acting out. He may not have actually said it explicitly, but he is most definitely talking about a sexual relationship with another male or a sexual encounter with another male. And he says that when he did so willingly, he was instantly hooked and addicted. Remember, he'd had these compulsive behaviors sexually since he was 4, and he was sexually molested. And now he's experienced this gender alienation that he talks about. He's being bullied for being too feminine. And now he is, for the first time, consensually and willingly engaging in a sexual relationship after all this history of abuse and compulsive behavior, and it all beginning with this deep, 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 unacknowledged shame that's his hidden secret, and all of those things are wrapped up in what he calls the gender confusion and his sexual orientation and his being gay. So all those things are kind of all put together, all these horrific, horrible, awful experiences.
Finally, I got to the point, I've got to sort this out. I mean, I never wanted to be gay. I fought it all my life. There's got to be some explanation. I'm going to look for answers. And so first of all,
Okay, this is important. He's saying that he wanted to look for answers. I've got to sort this out. I've got to figure it out. What made me gay? There's an interpretation and an assumption here. An assumption that something made him gay. He doesn't say where it came from or who told him that was a possibility. Based on around the time that this was happening, there are some pretty clear options about the messages that were being shared, particularly in social circles and Christian circles, about what made people gay. But he began with this assumption and said, something made me gay. I've got to figure this out.
Decided to research my life, and that's when I went back into my life and started connecting the dots. And I remembered the molestation at 4 years old, repeatedly in grade school, repeatedly in the military, and the abuse of my father and the mocking and all of this stuff from peers. And when they called for, you choose up sides for baseball games and all that when you're in school, I was always picked last. And sometimes they argued about it. No, you take him. No, you take him. I don't need him. You take him. Imagine what that does to a boy that's trying to become a man.
I mean, that's hard for any kid. I think that the whole practice should be taken away of kind of publicly picking kids. It's pretty painful for the kids who get picked last. But getting picked last in sports is probably not causative of people being gay, is all that I'm saying.
I put all that together and said, I was conditioned to be gay. The devil set me up. He knows from the time you are conceived, he knows you're on the way. And he has a customized plan for your life. And we don't know what it is, but he will put the wheels in motion to derail you one way or another. Friends, it doesn't matter how he throws you off track, just so he throws you off track. Many people like me, boys that were molested, they turned out to hate gays. And they didn't want to kill them. But many others are drawn into it.
I obviously disagree with most of the substance of what he's saying here, but I do appreciate that he called out that some of the hate for gay people is people responding from their own pain and hurt, and that this is something that's really sinful and not okay to hate or want to kill gay people. And I'm sure he's encountered people like that in his life.
See, Satan doesn't care. If you got hate in your heart, that's good enough. If you are addicted, that's good enough. So I put all this together and I began to realize the devil really did a number on me.
So this is kind of his understanding that he comes to, is that the devil made him gay through essentially all the most painful things that ever happened to him in his life was something engineered by Satan in order to make him gay, which is incredibly, think of what that must kind of do psychologically to a person, or how they process their sexuality and the way that they might think about their personality or their sexuality. Even just think about somebody who is straight. What if a straight person thought that they were straight because of sexual abuse? What would that do to them if they believed it? And then you start to wonder, does this really have to do with being gay? Is this really what made him gay? And of course, the glaring question is, what about people who didn't go through all this, like myself, who went through none of these things? I was usually picked first in sports. I'm sorry, that was probably inappropriate. But I don't know, maybe that's why I'm a queer woman. Anyways, you wonder, people who had great families like myself were never abused like myself, like what about us? But I'm even more concerned with people who actually were sexually assaulted, and this narrative that that's what made you gay seems to drive the shame in even harder and even stronger. I mean, I have literally had experiences talking to people about my sexuality who seemed in disbelief when I told them I'd never been sexually abused, because just based on the fact that I am attracted to women, they thought I must have been sexually abused. So it was like they almost disbelieved me, which is not a great experience to have when people are like, oh, you must have been sexually abused. And I just think how much more painful that must be to someone who has been sexually abused, who has experienced that shame at an early age that so often comes along with sexually abuse. And it's so important for the community to accept and defend that person, reaffirm their humanity, and not act as if they're this broken, awful person. And when that sexual abuse is mapped as a cause for a person's sexual orientation, rather than providing the healing that our friends and families and communities need to provide, it is just a compounding of the shame. And it is really, I think, a really big problem.
God's plan for my life far exceeded anything I could even imagine for myself. Higher than the highest human thought can reach. And eye has not seen or ear heard, neither have entered into the heart of man the things that God has prepared for them that love him. God's plan was far greater than anything I could even imagine. And everything he's asking of me is for my own health, my own happiness, my own joy and assurance and peace. How stupid could I be to reject that?
I thought it was particularly important to include that last section, because here we have someone who has associated so much pain, so much suffering, so much shame, compulsive behaviors, and addiction with being gay. And then on the other side, you have God is going to free me and heal me of all of those things. And when you listen to the story, you've got to think, he never had a healthy way of living out his sexuality as a gay man. That path wasn't presented to him, and so much shame was present from the very beginning. Does that mean that the shameful experiences he had, that he experienced as shameful, were causative of his sexuality? I don't think so. I wanted to include that last part because I think that it is important to understand that interplay between the sense that God is holy and good, and my sexuality since the age of 4 has been associated with pain and trauma and shame and rejection and all of those things. So I think one of the things that the ex-gay narrative does, it doesn't, understanding all those things about one's childhood does not make someone straight. Ron Woosley doesn't claim to be straight. None of the members of Coming Out Ministries claim that they no longer experience sexual attraction to the same gender. And it's pretty uncommon now for people who to say that, and we'll look in more depth about really why this is not a very kind of believable scenario and why it's been discredited so many times. But, Ron is not saying these things made me straight. I understood my childhood and it made me straight. But what it did do is it made him understand his sexual orientation and his being gay in terms of all the worst, most painful, most traumatic, most shameful, most sinful, and most addictive things in his life. And so when he accepts Jesus to cover up his sin of being gay, it's a way of pushing all of that shame and trauma aside so that now he's forgiven and it's gone and it's in his past and he left it behind. Now, I am not convinced that that's psychologically the most healthy thing to do, because as many, psychologists and therapists and researchers teach, you can't just ignore the unhealthy things. Like trauma needs to be processed and healed and treated therapeutically. I have major concerns about the ability of this approach to really apply broadly and be a healthy approach for a lot of people. But I can certainly see how this man has gained a level of healing and love for himself through his relationship with Christ and been able to walk away from these compulsive and addictive behaviors that he's had since he was 4 years old. So there are these unaddressed social problems of stigma, of the bullying he experienced and all of those things that get sidelined, and it really prevents a broader discussion that our society really needs about how minorities should be treated and about how children should be treated. Those are the issues I have with it, but we're going to dive more into, in our next video, where did these ideas come from? Why do people think that gender alienation, abuse from their father, sexual abuse makes people gay? Where did these ideas even come from? Did they just come from the air? Did people just sit down and think about their lives and figure it out independently? And the answer is no. There's a long history going back almost 100 years that we are going to just skim over next time to learn exactly where these ideas came from and where reparative therapy and conversion therapy and the ex-gay narrative originated. I know that for some of you, this was a difficult conversation. I know that the shame and the abuse that we talked about was probably pretty hard. And I know that it might be confusing to talk about why we are the way that we are. And I want to encourage you to find safe people who are 100% okay with you and are not treating you like a project or somebody to be converted over to their way of thinking. I encourage you to find people you can share with who are going to love you and support you and care for you. I believe the people at Kinship International are just such people, and I'm so proud to have them as sponsors for my video. Again, their link is in the description notes. There are many other organizations as well that are wonderful, encouraging places. And remember, when things get hard and you feel like you don't know all the answers, God's love for you is not dependent on having all the answers. You're going to be okay. Keep moving forward. We're going to figure this out.